The lamp flickered in room 307 of St. Vincent's Hospital, 3 in the morning, November 14th, 1886. The nurse had been sitting there for 6 hours, listening to the laboured breathing of the man in the bed. But calling him a man didn't quite capture it. He was 8 feet 4 inches tall, his frame filling a bed that had been specially built to contain him. His hands, even in their weakened state, were the size of dinner plates, and for the past 3 days he had refused to speak to anyone except her. His name was Captain Martin Van Buren Bates. The papers called him the Kentucky Giant. The world's tallest man, they said, though she knew that wasn't quite true. There had been others, taller ones, but those stories had been buried. And now, as his chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty, he was about to tell her why. She leaned closer as his lips moved. What he whispered to her in that moment would be locked away in a sealed letter for over a century. What he told her about the economic system that had created him, displayed him, and was now erasing him, would challenge everything she thought she knew about the world she lived in. And when she finally understood what he meant by the Great Exhibition, she would spend the rest of her life trying to forget it. This is the story of what really happened in room 307. The confession that was never supposed to reach you. Before we go further into what he told her that night, if you want to understand how deep the suppression of this history really goes, you need to subscribe to this channel. What you're about to hear isn't taught in any history book. The next video breaks down the financial records that prove giants weren't anomalies, they were assets. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. To understand why Martin Bates was dying alone in a New York hospital room, you have to go back to Whitesburg, Kentucky, 1845. The year he was born into a world that was already starting to forget what came before. His father was a farmer, average height. His mother stood 5 feet 6 inches, perfectly ordinary for the time. But Martin wasn't ordinary from the beginning. By age 10, he was 6 feet tall. By 15, he topped 7 feet. The local doctor had no explanation. The family whispered about ancestors, about bloodlines that went back further than anyone cared to remember. But in 1860, when Martin reached his full height of 8 feet 4 inches, the whispers stopped, because by then someone had arrived with an offer. His name was P.T. Barnum, though he sent a representative to do the initial negotiation. The offer was simple. Martin could stay in Whitesburg and break his back farming land that would never love him back, or he could come to New York and make more money in a month than his father had seen in a lifetime. All he had to do was stand on a stage and let people look at him. Martin took the offer. He was 19 years old. What Barnum didn't tell him, what none of them told any of the giants, was that he wasn't special. He was one of many. And the American Museum where he would spend the next 6 years wasn't a museum at all. It was a catalogue, a living inventory of a previous age that was being systematically dismantled. The 1860s were the golden age of the exhibition circuit. If you were tall enough, strange enough, or different enough, someone would pay to see you. But the giants were different. They weren't freaks or curiosities. They were evidence. Evidence of a time before the great mud floods, before the resets, before the maps were redrawn and the history books were rewritten. And the people running the exhibitions knew it. Martin's first show was in January 1861. He stood on a platform in Barnum's museum wearing a suit that had cost more than his father's house and watched as hundreds of people filed past. They paid 25 cents each. Some reached up to touch his hand. Others asked him to lift objects to prove his strength. Children stared. Women gasped. Men scribbled notes in small leather journals. But there was one group that never spoke, never took notes, never reacted at all. They stood in the back, always 3 or 4 of them wearing identical dark coats. Martin asked Barnum about them once. Barnum's smile had vanished. He said only this: "Those men are the reason you get paid. Don't ask about them again." Martin didn't. Not for years. He toured with the exhibition circuit for the next decade. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis. Every city had a theatre ready for him, a stage built to hold his weight, and crowds that never seemed to shrink. He met other giants during those years. Angus MacAskill, the Scottish giant, who could lift a ship's anchor that took 4 normal men to move. Chang Yu-sing, the Chinese giant, who spoke 5 languages and told Martin about Beijing's records documenting giants as scholars and architects, not curiosities. Anna Swan, 7 feet 11 inches tall, became his wife in 1871. They were married on stage in London, the ceremony attended by Queen Victoria herself. The papers called it the wedding of the century. What they didn't mention was that the entire event had been orchestrated by exhibition managers who saw the commercial potential of a giant couple. The marriage license included clauses about exhibition rights, touring obligations, and profit sharing that made Martin sick when he read them years later. But at the time, he was young and in love, and he signed everything. The wedding tour took them across Europe for 18 months. France, Germany, Italy, Spain. Everywhere they went, the same pattern repeated. Sold-out theatres, newspaper coverage, and those silent men in dark coats watching from the back of every venue. In Paris, Martin glimpsed something that would haunt him. The Louvre had a private viewing room containing giant skeletons from Egypt, Peru, North America, and Asia, some dated to thousands of years before the accepted timeline. When Martin asked about it, his handler went pale. The room didn't exist. If he mentioned it again, the tour would end and he'd be shipped home with nothing. Martin stayed quiet, but he remembered. Back in America by 1873, Martin noticed things during those years. Small things at first. The other giants he met, the ones taller than him, had a way of disappearing. Not dying, not retiring, just vanishing from the circuit. One month they'd be headlining in Cincinnati. The next month their name would be scrubbed from every poster, every advertisement, every record. When he asked about them, the managers would shrug. They went home, they'd say. But Martin knew better. He'd visited their hometowns. There was never any record of them returning. He started keeping a list. Names, last known locations, dates of disappearance. By 1880 he had 43 names, 43 giants who had simply vanished from public record. Some had families who were still searching for them. Some had left behind contracts and obligations that should have prevented them from just walking away. But they were gone. And when Martin pressed the managers for answers, the responses became threatening. Stop asking questions, focus on the show, remember who pays your salary. The disappearances accelerated after 1873. That was the year the financial panic hit, the year the banks started failing, the year the government began the Great Consolidation. Martin didn't understand the connection then. He was too busy performing, too busy playing the role of the happy giant who loved being stared at. But he felt it. The shift, the way the men in dark coats started appearing more frequently, the way contracts started, including clauses about intellectual property and exhibition rights in perpetuity, the way giants started dying. Anna died in 1888, 2 years after Martin. But in 1886 she was still alive, still touring, still standing beside him on stages across America. They had tried to have children. 2 babies, both born impossibly large, both dead within hours. The doctors said it was natural. Bodies that size aren't meant to reproduce, they explained. Martin didn't believe them. He'd seen the medical reports, the ones that weren't supposed to leave the hospital. Both children had been healthy. Both had died after being examined by doctors he didn't recognize. Both had been buried quickly in unmarked graves before he or Anna could object. That's when Martin started asking questions, real questions, dangerous questions. He wanted to know where the other giants had gone. He wanted to know why every city's historical society had records of giants from the 1700s and 1800s, but none from the current era. He wanted to know why the Smithsonian kept requesting the bodies of deceased giants, but never put them on display. He wanted to know who the men in dark coats worked for. The answers started coming in 1885, not from Barnum, not from the managers, but from someone else. An older man, a former exhibition coordinator named Thomas Wheeler, who was dying of tuberculosis in a Philadelphia boarding house and had decided he didn't care about secrets anymore. Wheeler had worked in the exhibition industry for 30 years. He'd started as a ticket collector in 1855 and worked his way up to coordination and logistics. He'd seen things no one was supposed to see. He transported bodies. He'd delivered sealed envelopes to government officials. He'd stood guard while Smithsonian representatives excavated burial mounds in the dead of night. And now, with months to live and nothing to lose, he was ready to talk. Their first meeting happened in February 1885. Martin had tracked him down through a network of former performers who whispered Wheeler's name with a mixture of fear and respect. The boarding house room was small and smelled of medicine and death. Wheeler sat in a chair by the window, a blanket across his lap despite the February cold, and got straight to the point. "You want to know where they went?" Wheeler said. It wasn't a question. Martin nodded. Wheeler told him about the Smithsonian's basement first. Not the public areas, the ones tourists could visit, but the restricted sections that required special clearance. About the rows and rows of skeletons, 8 feet tall, 9 feet tall, some reaching 11 feet, stored in wooden crates and metal cabinets. About the cataloguing system that labelled them as historical curiosities, with identification numbers but no names, no dates, no origin stories. About the deliberate destruction of burial mounds across Ohio, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Mounds that contained evidence of civilizations that weren't supposed to exist, according to the established historical timeline. Wheeler had documentation. Shipping manifests showing the transport of oversized specimens from excavation sites to Washington, D.C. Payment receipts showing large sums changing hands between Smithsonian officials and private donors, money specifically earmarked for acquisition and storage. Correspondence between museum directors and railroad magnates discussing the management of problematic evidence. He told Martin about the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, where the Smithsonian had displayed a giant skeleton publicly for exactly 3 days before it was abruptly removed following complaints from a group of influential donors who threatened to withdraw funding. The skeleton, which stood 9 feet 6 inches and had been excavated from a mound in Wisconsin, simply vanished. No explanation given, no records kept. The display case was refilled with a mastodon skeleton, and the incident was never mentioned again in official communications. Wheeler pulled out a worn leather journal and showed Martin the entries. Each page contained a name, a date, and a location. Giants who had been on the exhibition circuit, giants who had disappeared, and next to each name, a notation. Claimed by Smithsonian, transferred to medical facility, body acquired post-mortem, page after page of systematic documentation and disposal. The exhibition circuit isn't entertainment, Wheeler said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's documentation and control. Every giant who steps onto a stage is photographed, measured, catalogued, and tracked. When they die, their bodies are claimed by medical research institutions before families can intervene. The goal is simple. Erase the physical evidence of a previous era. Make sure that in 50 years, 100 years, no one will believe giants ever walked the earth in any significant numbers. Martin asked Wheeler why. Why go through such elaborate effort? Why spend so much money suppressing something that seemed so obvious? Wheeler's answer changed everything Martin thought he understood about the world. Because they built everything. The cathedrals, the courthouses, the government buildings, the infrastructure we claim to have built in the 1800s. They built it centuries earlier, and we've spent the last 100 years taking credit for it and selling it piece by piece. Look at any major city in America. The oldest buildings, the ones they call historic, have doors 12 feet tall, ceilings 20 feet high, staircases with steps built for legs much longer than ours. They weren't built with that scale for aesthetics. They were built for the people who actually lived in them. Wheeler explained the economic angle. The Industrial Revolution hadn't built Western civilization. It had inherited and rebranded it. The railroad barons, the banking families, the industrial magnates, they all understood that their wealth and power rested on the narrative of human progress. They were the great builders, the innovators, the titans of a new age. But if people knew the truth, If they understood that the infrastructure they claimed to have created already existed and they'd simply claimed ownership of it, the entire economic system would collapse, their legitimacy would evaporate, their fortunes, built on the mythology of creation, would be exposed as nothing more than successful theft. If people knew that these structures were built by hands that could lift stones, we'd need cranes to move today, Wheeler continued. If they understood that the timeline we teach in schools is a fabrication designed to justify the current distribution of wealth and power, everything falls apart. The banks lose their authority. The industrialists lose their claims to genius. The government loses its legitimacy. So they do what power always does. They control the evidence, they control the narrative, and they eliminate the witnesses. Martin didn't believe him. Not at first, but Wheeler gave him names, documents, financial records. And Martin started digging. He found banking documents that showed the Smithsonian receiving direct funding from a consortium of railroad barons and industrial magnates. He found insurance policies taken out on giants, with death benefits going not to families but to medical research facilities. He found contracts that gave exhibition managers the right to claim the bodies of performers for scientific purposes. He found a pattern, and the pattern made him sick. By early 1886, Martin had stopped performing. He told people he was ill, which wasn't entirely untrue, but the real reason was that he'd started writing. Letters to newspapers, letters to government officials, letters to anyone who might listen. He had proof, he said, proof of a conspiracy to erase an entire epoch of human history, proof that the modern age was a lie built on the bones of giants. The letters were ignored, or more accurately, they were intercepted. Martin never knew that none of them reached their intended recipients. He never knew that the men in dark coats had been reading his mail for months. In September 1886, Martin collapsed during a rare public appearance. The doctor said it was heart failure, a natural consequence of his size. But the nurse who attended him in those first hours before he was transferred to St. Vincent's noticed something strange. Marks on his arms that looked like injection sites, a chemical smell on his breath that she couldn't identify, a tremor in his hands that suggested poisoning, not cardiac arrest. She tried to report it. She was told to keep quiet or lose her license. Martin was moved to St. Vincent's Hospital in New York on November 10th. The official story was that he was receiving the best care available. The reality was that he was being isolated. No visitors except pre-approved medical staff. No correspondence in or out. And one nurse, assigned to him around the clock, who had a reputation for discretion. Her name was Margaret Sullivan. She was 32 years old, a veteran of battlefield medicine from the Civil War, and she didn't scare easily. But when she walked into room 307 and saw the man in the bed, saw the fear in his eyes and the way he clutched a leather journal to his chest, she knew this wasn't a normal case. Martin didn't trust her at first. He'd been betrayed too many times. But over the course of 3 days, as his condition deteriorated and the doctors assured everyone he'd be dead by the weekend, he began to talk. Small things first. Stories about the exhibition circuit, memories of Anna, complaints about the food. But on the third night, November 14th, he told her the real story. He told her about the great exhibition. Not Barnum's museum, not the circus, but the original exhibition. The one that happened before the reset. The one where giants weren't anomalies, but the norm. Where the architecture we claim to have built in the 1800s already existed, towering and impossible, built by hands that could lift stones we'd need cranes to move today. He told her about the economic conspiracy, how the banking families of Europe and America had coordinated the suppression of this history, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that they didn't build Western civilization. They inherited it and rebranded it. How the Smithsonian wasn't a museum but a vault, designed to hide evidence, not preserve it. How every giant on the exhibition circuit was both a commodity and a loose end. He told her about the documents he'd collected, the proof he'd gathered, names, dates, financial transactions, evidence of a coordinated effort spanning decades to rewrite history and claim credit for accomplishments that weren't theirs. He told her where he'd hidden the papers. in a safety deposit box in Philadelphia under an assumed name. And then, at 3 a.m, as the lamp flickered and his breathing became shallow, he told her the part that terrified him most. He told her that they were already rewriting his life, that after he died, the official records would show him as an anomaly, a medical curiosity, nothing more. That his letters, his research, his entire effort to expose the truth would be erased. That in 50 years, 100 years, people would read about him in history books and see only a tall man who stood on stages for money. Margaret listened. She held his hand, those massive hands that were already starting to cool, and she listened to every word. When he finished, when he told her everything, he made her promise 2 things. First, retrieve the documents. Second, wait. Wait until the world was ready to hear the truth, because in 1886, he said, no one would believe her, they'd call her crazy, lock her away, or worse. But someday, he said, people would start asking questions. Someday they'd notice the impossible architecture, the erased history, the pattern of suppression. And when that day came, she needed to make sure his story survived. Martin Van Buren Bates died at 4:17 a.m. on November 14, 1886. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure due to gigantism. The obituaries called him a beloved entertainer and gentle giant. His body was claimed by the Smithsonian Institution for Scientific Research before Anna could arrange a funeral. She fought the decision for 6 months. She lost. Martin was buried in an unmarked grave in Maryland, his skeleton catalogued and stored in the basement of the Natural History Museum, where it remains to this day. Margaret Sullivan retrieved the documents from Philadelphia 3 weeks after Martin's death. The safety deposit box held more than expected. Financial ledgers showing payments from railroad magnates to the Smithsonian for specimen acquisition. Correspondence between exhibition managers and government officials discussing the giant problem. Medical records documenting the systematic poisoning of performers who asked too many questions. And maps showing burial mounds excavated and destroyed between 1870 and 1886, each site marked with skeletons recovered and their disposition. The most damning were the architectural surveys. Page after page showing door frames built for people 8 to 10 feet tall, ceiling heights that made no sense for a population averaging 5.5 feet, load-bearing structures calculated for weights far exceeding normal human requirements, notations in the margins discussing how to modernize structures by lowering ceilings, reducing door heights, and adding false walls to hide the original scale. She understood what Martin had meant. This wasn't about giants. It was about control. If people knew the infrastructure of the industrial age had been inherited rather than built, that the wealth of the robber barons came from claiming ownership of existing structures, the entire power structure would collapse. Margaret kept her promise. She sealed the documents in a leather case with her account of Martin's confession and hid them in her family's Massachusetts estate. She left instructions that the case should only be opened after her death. She died in 1923, having never spoken publicly about room 807. The case was opened in 1924. Her nephew read all the documents and believed them. That terrified him. If genuine, Margaret had been in danger her entire life. He resealed the case and told no one. When he died in 1956, his children found it, read the contents, and maintained the silence. What could they do? Who would believe them? The documents stayed hidden until 1984, when historian Robert Connolly stumbled across a reference to Martin Bates in an old medical journal. By then the world had changed, the internet was coming, information was becoming harder to control. People were starting to ask questions about the old architecture, the impossible timelines, the Smithsonian's locked basement. The historian tried to publish the documents. The journal he worked for refused. He tried other journals. They refused. He tried to go public. 3 weeks later, his house was burglarized. The only things stolen were his research materials and his computer. But he'd made copies. And one of those copies made it online in 2003. A scanned PDF of Margaret's letter, blurry and barely readable, uploaded to a conspiracy forum that no one took seriously. Most people ignored it. But a few didn't. A few started digging. And they found things. They found the financial records of the Smithsonian showing payments from private donors specifically earmarked for specimen management. They found news articles from the 1870s and 1880s describing burial mounds containing skeletons of extraordinary size that were excavated and immediately transferred to Washington, D.C. They found the photographs of giants on the exhibition circuit, hundreds of them that had been systematically removed from public archives. They found Martin's name in a Smithsonian catalogue from 1887, listed under acquired specimens, with his height, weight and bone measurements recorded in cold clinical detail. They found the pattern Martin had died trying to expose, and they found something else, something Martin hadn't known but had suspected. The giants weren't the only ones being erased. Entire civilizations, entire architectural traditions, entire epochs of human achievement were being systematically removed from the historical record. The narrative being constructed was simple. Human progress is linear. We are the pinnacle. Everything before us was primitive. The buildings we inherited were built by us. The knowledge we discovered was invented by us. The wealth we control is earned by us. But it was a lie. A lie Martin Bates died trying to expose. A lie that required the deaths of hundreds of giants, the destruction of thousands of burial mounds, and the suppression of millions of documents. A lie that continues to this day because the alternative, the truth Martin whispered to a nurse at 3 a.m. in 1886, would unravel everything. The Smithsonian still has Martin's skeleton. It's in storage along with dozens of others, all labelled as historical curiosities or anatomical anomalies. They've never been displayed. They never will be, because displaying them would mean answering questions no one in power wants to answer. Margaret's documents still exist, copies of them anyway, scattered across hard drives and encrypted files, passed between researchers who know better than to publish them openly. Every few years someone tries, every few years they fail. Not because the evidence isn't compelling, but because the system that suppressed it in 1886 is still operational today. Different names, different methods, but the same goal. Control the past, control the present. Martin knew that when he died he'd become a footnote, a tall man who made people smile. But he also knew that someday someone would listen. Someone would connect the dots. Someone would ask why there are so many stories about giants in the historical record, but none in the modern one. Why the architecture of the 1800s looks identical to structures supposedly built centuries earlier. Why the Smithsonian's basement is locked to the public. He knew that when that day came, his story would matter. Because his story isn't about him. It's about the system that killed him. The system that erases inconvenient truths. The system that rewrites history to serve power. And that system hasn't changed. It's just gotten better at hiding. If this video made you question what else has been hidden, you're not alone. Next week I'm breaking down the financial records that prove the Smithsonian was funded to suppress this evidence, the banking families behind it, the government officials who helped, and the pattern of erasure continuing today. Subscribe so you don't miss it. They've spent over a century making sure you never hear this story, and they're counting on you to keep scrolling, keep ignoring, keep accepting their narrative. Don't let them win. The lamp in room 307 went dark at 4:17 a.m. on November 14th, 1886. But the truth Martin Bates whispered in that room is still burning, and it's waiting for you to see it.